Thank you for joining us again for Monsterama, Virtual Monsterama 2020. My name is Darren Bush. I'm the co-director of the literature track this year. You are here for One Chair, Four Pages, 100 Years of Lovecraft's Randolph Carter. And if you're not entirely sure about the title of the panel, we will definitely explain that in just a couple of minutes. What I want to do before we get started is let our fabulous panelists introduce themselves. I'm going to start with this gentleman right here, Kyle Mitchell. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hey everybody, I'm Kyle Mitchell, published poet, published 2 books of poetry, and a longtime Atlanta con goer, and sat on some panels at Anachrocon, and been regular at Dragon Con, and proud member of the Dead Pirates of Sci-Fi fandom, who run the con suites at many of Atlanta's conventions, and a longtime Lovecraft fan.
Excellent. Michael?
I'm Michael G. Williams. I'm an award-winning horror, science fiction, and urban fantasy writer. I most recently won the 2020 Manly Wade Wellman Award from the North Carolina Speculative Fiction Foundation for the sci-fi detective novel A Fall in Autumn. And I'm a long-time fan of horror, especially of the intersections of horror and science fiction, which is one of the things that Lovecraft most loved also. And I'm somebody who really enjoys a significant portion of Lovecraft's stories, while also being honest about the ways that we can be critical about him.
Excellent. And I am Darren Bush. I'm also a science fiction and fantasy author. I've been specializing in short stories for a little while now and having a lot of fun with that. I've also been a huge fan of Lovecraft ever since I was a kid, which might be an indication that my parents got me started in some science fiction a little too early. It is possible they started me off a little too early, especially with things like Lovecraft. I was fortunate enough to be working in a bookstore in Atlanta when the revisiting of the Lovecraft compendiums came out. I don't have one with me, or I would show you. They're these black and gray trade paperbacks about this big, and they've got these horrific artworks on the covers, and between I think it was 2 or 3 editions, they had all of his best stories, the novellas and the short stories in one compilation. I used my paycheck to buy those books as soon as I saw them, and dove back into Lovecraft, and have really never recovered from being a fan of Lovecraft. As Michael said, I am also aware that we are celebrating a part of Lovecraft, and there's another part of the Lovecraft story which requires some criticism and some understanding to put things in perspective. So I definitely don't want to spend a lot of time talking about the criticism of Lovecraft the person or the effects of his fiction. If we need to, we can, but I want to let people know that we're not skipping that because we don't agree or don't have opinions.
Right.
This is really a celebration of the fiction and the universe. I think we can handle trying to find an upbeat way to enjoy Lovecraft and his horrific tentacle monsters from outer space. Let me also say very quickly that this is the 100th anniversary of the Statement of Randolph Carter, which is one of Lovecraft's shortest pieces that isn't poetic prose, I think would be the right term. It is essentially a one-man, one-act play. I envision this as a guy sitting in a chair with a very bright light on him, and that's it. The whole stage is empty other than that. I've been tempted for years to put that on as a production or to attempt it. And it is also, in my opinion, it's one of Lovecraft's most efficient stories, because in 4 pages, he made a permanent impression on me. It was one of the stories that made me a fan of his. It was one of the stories that made me realize that he was changing the game, that had changed the game and had influenced a lot of people later. So I'm thinking I read that story for the first time about 30 years ago, 35 years ago. So what about you guys? What was your first exposure to Statement of Randolph Carter?
For me, it was probably reading the one of the S.T. Joshi compendiums, the annotated H.P. Lovecraft compendia that he put out, where I think that was probably my first one, where I realized I was reading the Statement of Randolph Carter. And for me, I really love that story because I'm a huge fan of that I don't know exactly what to call it, that like form factor of story. You know, it gets in, it tells its story, it gets out. It's a very personal account. We have no idea, frankly, whether the narrator is reliable or not. We have no idea if the story that he's telling is true. It could just as easily be some really weird alibi that he's feeding people. And I just like the intimacy of the story, the way that it's like very small and contained. The world isn't at risk here. It's just this guy's sanity and experience and the friend who, you know, went downstairs.
Hmm.
Yeah, and for me, this is a testament to the power of cons, because I went to, I believe, my first Dragon Con 20 years ago, 20 years ago. And and there I went to a Lovecraft panel, and I had heard of Lovecraft, and I don't believe I'd read any of his stuff, but I went to a Lovecraft panel and like actually took notes. I was taking notes from all these people that were, which, you know, I just was like, how have I not been reading it? Because I'm a big Poe fan. And so obviously he influenced Lovecraft and so many others. But I was literally just taking notes, like, okay, I've got to get back and get books from the library and, you know, go to Barnes and Noble and find this stuff. And then later in the con as well, the Atlanta Radio Theater Company put on a radio play, as they often do, of one of Lovecraft's pieces. And I can't remember what it was. It was the Dunwich Horror or At the Mountains of Madness or something. And so it was around that time, within the first year or two, as I was then going through the major works of Lovecraft, that I came across the longer ones, you know, his novellas and stuff, but then also read The Statement of Randolph Carter. And I really fell in love with the Dreamlands, you know, kind of stories, which he was a part of at least two. Right? So.
Yeah. So, Kyle, do you want to let our audience know basically what happens in this story? After 100 years, are there any spoilers? But
Right, exactly. Spoiler alert. No, you know, it's an interesting story of a, you know, statement, and I don't know that it's necessarily clear from the story that it's verbally being told, and we've just reading about whatever, like you were kind of saying, as if of a play, or if it's a written statement, like you'd say here, you know, that hard-boiled detective, you know, sits you down with the bright light on you and says, here, just a legal pad, and just here, write your statement out. Yeah. But goes into talking about how he and his friend Warren, right? I think it was, that began like basically one of the grave robbing tales of Lovecraft, and going out into, I think it was the swamps, or they went and this cemetery and graveyard, which is a different locale from several of you know, a lot of the, you know, kind of houses and Lovecraft country up there, Miskatonic University, that kind of thing. So it was, you know, going outdoors to this cemetery and clearing space, and essentially opening up a cemetery vault in the ground, essentially, that had stairs going down into it, and then they had brought along portable telephone device, whatnot, with, you know, enough cable for him to carry on his shoulder and basically go down into the depths, you know, into the darkness there, with just his flashlight, portable lamp, you know, at that time, and them keep in touch with what he's seeing as he's going to, his friend Warren's going down, and what Randolph Carter is hearing on the other end of the line, as he describes this amazing underground city that he sees, and all kinds of unspeakable things he just, like, the human eye hasn't seen, and whatnot. And then eventually a creature of some kind that answers back on the line at the very end. One of the best kind of closing lines in Lovecraft.
Absolutely, it is one of the, in my mind, it's one of the best last sentences of any story in science fiction. It's a great way of ending the story. It's a very abrupt, blunt ending, and you kind of have to insert your own reaction, and like what happens after that. Well, like Michael said, is he lying? Is it a true story? Is there something in the middle? So yeah, it's a fascinating way to end a story, which this is another great example of a very, very short tale that begs for hundreds of pages of information, explanation. You want Warren's version of the tale, you don't get it. You don't
No.
get it. No,
Mm.
you're just lost.
Are y'all familiar with the origin of this story?
No, I am not. I have to admit, but I'm fascinated.
Lovecraft had a dream. This is based entirely on a dream of Lovecraft's. And he had a dream about himself and another writer with whom he was friends finding themselves in a graveyard, and the friend experiences the things that Warren experiences in the story. And Lovecraft awoke from this dream and immediately made some notes and wrote it down, and then just like tried to create a framing mechanism for this to turn it into fiction. And so in that way, I also love the fact that Carter like he is born in Lovecraft's brain as somebody who was kind of the dreamlands, because he literally comes from a dream that Lovecraft had.
Hmm. And
Cool.
also, wasn't Randolph Carter either in or referred to in two or three other stories that came later?
Oh,
I
he's in a
know
bunch of stories.
yeah.
He's actually probably the most continuous character in Lovecraft's body of original work.
Hmm.
But he shows up in all kinds of stuff and has, wild adventures as the lead character of the Dreams of Unknown Kadath. He sees more of the strange and unexplained parts of the Lovecraftian universe than
Hmm.
anybody else, and lives to tell the tale.
Hmm.
And I was thinking when listening to the audio version of the statement of Randolph Carter again before this panel, of where it fit in Randolph Carter's life compared to the other stories like the Dream of Unknown Kadath. Because in that, which is much longer, and it's starting out, I think, saying that he dreamed 3 times of that the dreamlands, that world or whatever, and finally made it there and was able to actually journey and so forth. So I was curious, I don't know, like where this where in Lovecraft's mind, where it fell in the life of his fictional character in comparison to the other stories.
The impression I have, if I remember correctly, the statement of Randolph Carter is the origin of Randolph Carter's supernatural adventures
Mm.
as they appear on the page. That like this is chronologically in Randolph Carter's life, this is the first story where he appears.
Hmm. Yeah, because there's some of the language that Carter uses in the statement of um, kind of implies that he's new to this, that he's not really,
Yeah.
he's not really attached to it yet. I would, in my head canon, the shock of Warren's death is what opens his mind up, his dream state up to this. It's like you. This happens a lot in X-Files and Supernatural and in movies where someone will be introduced to the world through some violent or strange occurrence, and then all of a sudden, everywhere they look, they see people that are a little off. This happened in Men in Black also. Once you know they're aliens, you suddenly go, what about that guy? Yeah, that guy's an alien. And so I think that's the way I always interpreted Randolph Carter's future appearances, his later appearances, was that this just somehow the police let him go or not, and he's back out in the world, and he's one of those people that's like, no, please don't let me free. There's monsters and things. Put me back in the cell. And then somehow he has these other further adventures. So I kind of think that he approaches this first story with Warren. Um, I think he sounds kind of naive, and he seems to be going through this huge transitional shock in
Am I
that
correct
story.
in remembering that this is the story in which he describes Warren as having been the dominant personality in their friendship?
Yes, that's correct.
And
And
so
then
like
he
that always
had,
to me sounded like Warren was experienced at this and had said to Carter, come with me on this adventure, I'll show you some stuff.
Hmm.
Yeah, because he references that he specifically says that Warren had a large collection of occult books and grimoires and that kind of thing, that tomes that he liked to, and this was kind of the latest of the studies or whatever that he was dragging him along, with, and asked him to go along with. So, and obviously that, pulling back of the veil, even just from books, is one thing, and then if you actually go out to a cemetery and you uncover this stone entryway, and going down it, and then you hear this like gurgling, unnatural, monstrous kind of voice on the other end, basically confirm that your friend is dead. That's the final line there. You fool, Warren. Warren is dead. And this, but described in this this gurgly, kind of monstrous voice. Yeah, that would probably do it for you to open the door to believing that there's more out there.
I've always loved the basically the wired walkie-talkie concept of the telephones too, because this is probably one of the earliest instances of somebody looking at the ways technology was opening up the possibilities of storytelling. And saying, I mean, we watched countless TV shows and movies, including The X-Files and Buffy and a whole bunch of other things, have to figure out ways to get people's cell phones out of their hands so that the episode could continue. Yeah. And this is one of the earliest, best instances of what if we get the technology into somebody's hands, and that's what allows the story to start.
Yeah.
I agree. Just like you said, Michael, the beginning here, that you love fiction, or horror that blends with the connection of sci-fi and horror and technology and the unknown. And that this is a perfect example of that. That just imagine if you are in 1920 and you've got this still, even though it's more domesticated, or it's more commonplace. For telephones and telephone technology and that kind of thing, it still was not perfected, and nothing, So to be able to say, well, how, as an author, as a creator, how can I take this and put it into action? Like what would pioneers, trailblazers in the occult do with that? That then when someone reading it can say, oh man, I just pick up the phone, when I need to talk to somebody, and to have that. And then I said the portable kind of telephone radio kind of, system like that. Yeah. It's, I think to me, those are the best, just like Jules Verne and, others. That's H.G. Wells, whatnot, that why they last so long, why they still hold, because we can relate to those things that are really scary and not truly all tested. And what are the limits? How can we be using this technology now for new ways that have never been used before?
I think that you could translate Statement of Randolph Carter into modern, current technology, because the cell phone would allow you to communicate between Carter and Warren, and the fact that all you got to do is add a half a sentence about, I heard something clatter as if he dropped his cell phone.
Yeah.
And then the last line where the monster says, you fool, Warren is dead, right? And then oblivion. So it is wonderful that he allowed us, with that modern fancy technology, he allowed us to take that story and extend it 100 years in the future and have it still work perfectly fine.
Yeah.
Because the prosaic explanation of why Carter didn't get eaten by the same monsters is because they're I don't know, they're afraid of the sun, they don't like the sunlight, they turn to stone in the sun, something involved with they can't come up to the surface, and Carter was on the surface. And so the idea that he survived within the Lovecraft universe makes perfect sense, especially when you realize that the monsters don't care. They're not scared of Warren going and blabbing to the police. They're not scared of the police. They're not scared of any of us. They don't see us as anything other than ants to be squished, or food, or both. So the idea that he survived, the idea that he didn't actually see any of that stuff, works perfectly. It increases the tension and the horror, but also it allows us to have, as I think, as Michael said, you have that moment of doubt about, okay, he's full of crap. Was he high, or are there monsters? It's so once you start putting yourself in the chair with him and you start working out the psychology, it gets even scarier to think about what other explanation is there besides he's telling the truth. And I love it when Lovecraft does that to us.
And you know what? The first time that I read Statement of Randolph Carter, I just took it for granted, right? I just read it and I just believed. I just went along with what he did. And then the second time, when reading it through, probably 5 years later, I kind of scratched my head and said, "Wait a minute. This is described as like a monstrous, gurgling, kind of unnatural voice that's underground in this underground tomb, but yet he speaks in English that Randolph Carter understands as English." And so I'm thinking then, like, oh crap, this was not just like you see on a lot of sci-fi and horror, whatever, that just automatically when you go to another planet you can speak their language. Why would they speak Terran English? But for him to that creature there underneath, then I realized, holy crap, like, is this some kind of humanoid that's degenerated, or was it trapped down there on purpose? It had been up above ground and they had entombed it on purpose so that it would not be out amongst us. Or was it more like kind of, what is that, lurker in the darkness? That's more of the kind of mountain degenerated creatures that kind of come and when lightning strikes and that kind of thing. So that blew my mind, kind of just after initially just going with it and then realizing, holy crap, he spoke English. That creature down there that presumably killed Warren spoke English.
Yeah. And of course we're talking about people who create these situations themselves as part of our thought process. So I can come up with 4 or 5 other reasons why that thing spoke English, and every one of them is worse than the one before.
I mean, well, and even one of the things that occurred to me was that in one of the very late stories about Carter, there's this whole concept that every creature in the universe is just a manifestation of the same like cosmic source, and that if you can get back to that source or connect with it somehow, then you can connect to the other manifestations out there. And so maybe this thing is just one of those, maybe it's part of that same continuity of, this thing has access to the experience of other manifestations of the like external powers of the universe, and thus it just can look in on human minds and understand human language. Or it's been down there listening to radio programs and polishing its English for 10 years at this point, or whatever. It's got elder god internet.
Or
when Berlitz start their language learning.
Yeah. One of the things that I thought of immediately was it's a Renfield. It's a human slave. Right. So I just have this wonderful vision of this gigantic batrachian creature carrying off Warren's body and looking at the slave and going, answer that call and then get back to work. Right? That's not any dumber than any of the other 75 ideas you can come up with.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's just this.
Like in some of the was it the Whisper in Darkness? And you've got some of that technology blending as well with and it could have been that it had some kind of technology like that to where it was able to then speak, and it was actually through Warren's mouth, but now he's dead and it's somehow using its abilities or technology to actually use Warren's own tongue and vocal cords and language to say, "You fool, Warren is dead."
Yeah, and we could probably speculate for another 20 minutes and not run out of ideas.
Let's do it. Let's see what we can.
Sure. Okay. We'll see if we get edited out for this. I got 100 more. But But the reason why I like indulging in this conversation is because this is something that Lovecraft did really, really well, was he gave you enough rope to hang yourself.
Yeah.
Is he said, here's this thing. I think it's really scary. What do you think it is? And then you're going, yeah, it's really scary. He doesn't describe it. He doesn't give you anything to go on. He just puts it in your brain and lets your brain scare yourself
Well, I
terribly.
mean, look at the very next Randolph Carter story in the timeline, The Unnameable, where
Mm-hmm.
the whole deal is that the monster that ends up attacking them in the end can't be described because it can't even be sensed by like normal human means.
Mm-hmm.
And so the whole concept of it is that nobody is able to like warn anybody or write anything down or come to understand it.
Mm-hmm.
He manages to provide us with a whole bunch of different pieces of like physical evidence as a result of their attack, but he never describes the creature because it is incapable of being described. Well, that's a fascinating concept. I know people. One of them is my husband because he just finished listening to an audiobook that is the entirety of H.P. Lovecraft after having read none his entire life. And it was like 52 hours long. He did a lot of yard work in the course of listening to this. And he took stories like that as being kind of just lazy writing, like, well, if it's so unnameable, then how did anybody ever know to tell anybody? Things like that. But I like the way, and he and I talked about the fact that we both see it this way ultimately. I like the way that what Lovecraft often wants to do is meet you halfway. He gets a really important thing about both horror and humor. They often turn on the same hinge, which is that it's important to get you emotionally invested by getting you to help make the joke or help invent the monster. And so in either horror or humor, if you can tell half of the joke or the story and get the audience to invest emotionally in trying to predict the answer themselves before you reveal it, and then you just never reveal it, they're already in. Like they've bought in big time. It's going to have a
Mm-hmm.
big emotional impression on them.
Yeah, I'm reminded of the reality of Cthulhu. You guys have heard of Cthulhu, where Cthulhu is a non-Euclidean extension into our universe from Cthulhu's universe or some other universe where Cthulhu is coming from. And so the idea is that by definition, what we think of as Cthulhu is our feeble, tiny little brains attempting to interpret something that isn't from this universe. And so therefore, every single artist's depiction of Cthulhu, all of them are canon because that's the way that human being interpreted Cthulhu, even though you can't see Cthulhu really because our eyeballs and our brains just can't handle it. There's a wonderful, quick little aside, there's a wonderful little YouTube channel, I hope it's still around, called Calls to Cthulhu. And it's, yeah, no, if you haven't seen this, you got to see it. It's hysterical because what they've done is they've created a call-in radio talk show program with an audience, and Cthulhu is the little plushy hand puppet with the fingers. And at one point, somebody calls in and says, "Hey, Cthulhu, is that really you, or are you just a hand puppet?" And he explains this in detail, and then, of course, reaches through the phone and kills the guy. Right, and his explanation is, if your brain is so weak and timid and small that you think I look like a little plushy hand puppet, that's your problem. I'm a non-Euclidean entity that you can't blah, 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 blah. And then he reaches out and breaks his neck through the phone. It is a really awesome joke, but it's totally canon. That's really the way Lovecraft thought of Cthulhu and a lot of these other entities is if we picture a 200-foot tall octopoid dragon winged thing that likes to eat boats, that's our problem. That's the way, if that's the way we see it, that's the way we see it. And I think that Lovecraft did an excellent job of playing on that concept. To be honest, I would love to find out if he came up with that concept first and then exploited it, or if somewhere in the middle he went, I need to justify all of this non-describing. Let me see. Non-Euclidean entity. Yeah, that works. Let me write that down. I'd love to. Chicken and the egg. I don't know which one came first. Both are awesome, but I would love to find that out. It's Statement of Randolph Carter is an excellent example of him really knowing how to get you. I don't see it as being lazy writing. I can understand when some people would say that. I just don't agree.
Yeah, no, I see him as being a writer's writer, where he came up with some really amazing ideas and really worked to experiment with the forms of the storytelling
Mhm.
and to see what would happen when he threw different genres in the pot and stirred them up a little. And I think that by virtue of that, he has inspired some decades of really exceptional derivative, not even derivative isn't, I mean, derivative is technically the right word, but it's not like what I'm trying to say. I'm not trying to say that it's like lesser work, but he has inspired a ton of other work where they take the same concepts and improve on them or expand on them, or otherwise keep asking the question of what if, you know.
Mhm.
And that was really his great strength as a writer, was that he was great at asking what if.
Mhm.
Yeah, I agree. And we always look at, for a lot of writers, maybe present company excluded, I don't know, I don't want to speak for you, that you use your personal trauma and it goes into your writing. It's kind of hard not to, whether intentionally or unintentionally, subliminally or whatever, subconsciously. But he had a lot of early deaths, right? Was it his father, his grandmother, I think it was.
Mhm.
And so if you look at this story, yeah, and Randolph Carter going with his friend, and then basically almost like wanting to communicate with someone that he knew or loved again, it fits very much in line with what drew, depressed him. And then, he had some bad health and so forth, but to be introverted and stay inside and write and whatnot, which, thank goodness, I guess, for that, because it developed into some great fiction. But yeah, I think that it's some of that early work like that is indicative of some of his personal depression and trauma and life that he experienced, and then
Mhm.
being able, what would that look like in cosmic, or in weird tales.
Mhm.
Yeah, Carter in many ways is the closest to a stand-in for Lovecraft of any of the perspective characters from any of his writing. And he's this sensitive soul who lives in a world that doesn't really offer the things that he's interested in as being sort of supposedly the main course of life. And he hits adulthood and finds out that it's more boring than he hoped it would be. And he just escapes into dreams and fantasies and tries to live there forever. And in a way, it's very direct. It's pretty on the nose, as my editor would say.
Mhm.
But it's
Yeah.
also beautiful and inspiring, and a lot of us can identify with that.
Yeah. I find that a lot of when I dig into Lovecraft, hit the person, and I compare that to his fiction, I find that a lot of the stuff that that currently we consider to be problematic with Lovecraft, I think a lot of his fiction is reflective of his anxieties,
Hmm.
not his desires and not his opinions, but just his reaction to the world around him is soaked into his fiction, just like it is with everybody. Some people more subtle, some people not so subtle. I find that a lot of his kind of accidental opinions through his narrators or through his fiction reflect his internal struggles. It doesn't take a psychiatrist to put the two things together, and they just lock together very cleanly once you start to know him. There's one of the things that's on my to-do list as a writer is to read his letters. Um, many people have commented on how he was just a hugely prolific letter writer. If he was alive today, he would have an Instagram account, and he'd be on Facebook all the time, and he would just be constantly on social media talking to everybody about all this stuff. I love that he famously not only gave permission to other writers that were his contemporaries to use his nouns, to use his universe. I love that not only did he allow them to do that, but then when they came up with something cool, he'd put it in one of his future stories.
Yeah.
I don't remember exactly what it was, but there's a couple of well-known Lovecraft characters that aren't Lovecraft characters. They're creations of August Derleth or one of the other guys that were
Right.
buddies of his. Yep. And he went, "Oh, August, I love that. Can I have that back in my next story?" "Oh, yeah, of course." So, like, for example, famously, I think it was August who said, "We're going to call it the Cthulhu mythos," and Lovecraft went, "No, I hate that name." So anytime somebody says, "Oh, in the Cthulhu mythos," I have this little giggle where I go, "He didn't like that title, but he stuck with it."
Yeah, because as happens often in the publishing industry, right? When August Derleth founded Arkham House, right? He wanted to call it that, and that's the direction he wanted to take it. But what I've read was that Lovecraft himself wanted to call it Yog-Sothothery. Was
And
that was what he
yeah,
wanted to more call, and have Yog-Sothoth be more the central figure, though he also was more of a fan also of Hastur and being essential more so than Cthulhu. But maybe August Derleth was the better businessman in that, as it
I think.
turns out.
I mean, if you want to call Derleth his number one best disciple or cultist, if you'll pardon the expression, or if you want to say that August was Lovecraft's bulldog, which is a term that applies to other people too. If you want to say that he was Lovecraft's bulldog, I'm fine with that. But just also remember that August was the bulldog to prevent Lovecraft from making some mistakes. I think if he'd called it Yog-Sothothery, I don't think we'd be having this panel today. I, I love HP, love his universe. I think we got to give that one to August. I really do.
Yeah.
That's
It's not a
just,
very compelling title for a genre.
yeah, Yog-Sothothery. Like, there's marketing people out there going, "That's a terrible idea. Go back to Cthulhu."
Well, it's funny you mentioned about the letters too. I hadn't read a lot of them. I have several Lovecraft books, but when I was listening to audio versions of this Dreams of Terror and Death, the dream cycle of H.P. Lovecraft, they start off the collection with several letters and lost tidbits, where it just might literally have been like one piece of paper that he just woke up, like you're saying, Michael, woke up from a dream and just wrote. And one was with Randolph Carter, as I recall, and it was like literally just like the start of a story, and it was like the first couple paragraphs of a story, and that was it, and never got finished. But yeah, he wrote with and had he was definitely a writer's writer, and he had a group of 6 or 7 or 8 other male writers that he were in his circle, and that they corresponded a lot, and they met a lot, and kind of had those discussions of the what they were doing and what was hot and fresh, and
Mm-hmm.
thing to do. Yeah.
And they were very much, cross-pollinating
Mm-hmm.
across their worlds in some really interesting ways.
Yeah, the more I learn about Lovecraft's relationship with his contemporaries, the more I see that, the more I totally reject the idea that he was isolated, or that he was, like, he may have been an introvert, but I reject the idea of him like living out of his mother's basement and just kind of cowering from the world. He had his anxieties, he had his social issues, but his letter writing was amazing. His correspondence considered him to be a lively, fun guy with a great sense of humor, who loved letting people, as I said before, letting people play in his universe. So I just have a lot of respect for his ability to take other writers and help lift them up. He really was. And one thing I should say is, at least in the Atlanta convention circuit, I've noticed, present company included, that the writers as a community are very much like that. They're very much supportive of each other. They lift each other up. There's always exceptions to that in every group, especially the bigger you get. But I think Lovecraft would appreciate what we're doing. I think he would enjoy that we're having these kinds of conversations, not just about him. I think that he would get a kick out of how many conventions would invite him to come speak, that he would have to write a very long, polite letter that said, "No, have fun. You have permission to talk about me, but I just am not interested in being in the room." So anyway, that's just the way I see him.
I think he's the kind of guy who would be great in the comments section, but maybe not so much with the hallway conversation.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
that's yeah. I'll give you that, Michael. Absolutely. I
I
don't.
think to a certain degree, I mean, writers, we all, I mean, as human beings, have good days and bad days, and some are more good than bad or bad than good. But that I think that just for those of us that write, and even for me as a poet, I heard somebody say, I can't remember who it was, just recently, it said, oh, I think it was in Malcolm Gladwell's book, Talking to Strangers, I think it was talking about the ratio of suicides and to poets is like through the roof, more than any other type of writer, and which insert your own logic, whatever the reasoning is for that, whatnot. But I think that for when you're pumping out, when you're drawn to write, inspired to write, or just need to for cathartic purposes that he very well may needed to, of the subject matter, then I think that just it naturally comes that you're going to have, you're going to have some down days and introspection
Yeah.
And whatnot. But then, you also still live a life and have your friends and, social life and, get married and do all whatever you do.
Yeah, I think that we have a modern counterpart for this conversation, which is Stephen King, who absolutely was inspired by Lovecraft. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
he's written some stories that are not subtle about being in the Lovecraft universe. In fact, actually, I forget what the name of it was. It was. It starts with an R. It's a biblical reference title, but it was a short story or a novella in which he literally has the hero at the very, very end of the story find out that Lovecraft was right about everything the whole time. That's how the
Mm.
story ends. It isn't subtle. He doesn't call it Rilya, but the hero ends up in Rilya. And it's just, if you've read Lovecraft, it's a great story. It's great because it sneaks up on you. It really, really sneaks up on you. You get to like the last little bit and you go, he's been reading Lovecraft. But the reason I bring up Stephen King is because I've had people tell me, "Oh, Stephen King, what a messed up guy he must be." And I got to say, my feeling is the exact opposite because he's worked out all of his issues with all of us in his
Yeah.
writing. He has processed his fear of dogs and proms and plagues and the end of the
Writer's
world
block.
and writer's block and
Yeah.
dream catchers and aliens from outer space and Buicks.
Oh, and substance abuse and
Yeah.
like ways that each generation visits its own abuses on the next,
Mm-hmm.
and
Parenting,
I
bad
mean,
parenting,
hmm,
bad
Bad
parenting.
parenting.
bad parenting,
Yeah.
all kinds of stuff, and you don't even have to leave The Shining to get like that list.
Oh gosh. Yeah. The Shining. The Shining is a movie that you should watch right before you take Abnormal Psych 201.
Mhm.
It's full of good useful examples of how people can be messed up. But yeah, I think I wish that Lovecraft had um, I wish there was a way to establish that Lovecraft was working out his issues with his fiction and that was successful. And obviously, it's a little late to investigate that, but it strikes me that he was one of those people who looked into his own darkness and saw the reality of all of our darknesses. Every one of us has this darkness, and he looked into it and was like, okay, let me tell a story, and you guys deal with the fact that I just opened that up for you. And it did. He's got some stories. There's some lesser known stories where our hero ends up being the bad guy, like has a flashback and wakes up with like somebody's leg in his mouth, and it's like, oh, okay, whew, it's I don't hear anybody talking about that story, probably because it's like it really does pass over that boundary for our comfort, and it should. It's one of those kind of challenging sci-fi weird alien stories that it's really horrifying because who of us is capable of resisting the lure of what was creating that story essentially that turned him, because it's a great story about losing control, about thinking that you're so brave, you're going to go down into the basement of the castle and you're going to face your fears when the whole time you were the problem. I was like, that is really messed up.
I think that's what Lovecraft was trying to work out about himself. I think, I mean, I haven't read his letters, and obviously my hope is that it is not directly possible to assume that everything that's on a writer's pages is exactly what's in their heart either. But, so many of his stories are about someone who can't confront who they really are, can't confront what it is that they really want, and that ends up being their downfall, in some way, in some form or fashion. And I think that he was obsessed with trying to suppress something about himself. I don't know what. It's easy to come up with theories, but I don't think that there's a lot of evidence out there, for any of those theories in particular. But I think that because so many of his stories are about the idea that if somebody eases up for just a moment, relaxes their guard, for just a moment, then chaos comes spilling into the world through them. I think that that's probably what he was working on internally, and he did not finish the job.
Yeah, yeah.
Very
It's
true, because
also
there's a lot of stories that he wrote, the Dreamlands and cycles and stuff, where outside and then inside the Dreamlands too, about drug use and the mysterious drugs or whatnot that help you go to sleep and be able to enter and the Dreamlands and explore that, and people that abuse that to the point of madness and death and whatnot. And so to me, it's very interesting with like Randolph Carter, and I love that an author like that has such a wide range of stories and heroes and whatnot, that we get to see in some pieces, like the beginning, the origin, story, that even just very simple as the statement Randolph Carter was, and varying degrees in between, oftentimes facilitated by that friend that had dabbled, too much, and how similar that is to that kind of peer pressure that we all have, and we've always had that kind of friend that has been down into the basement and seen the rats in the walls. No, maybe not that, but we've got those friends that kind of pull us along into things that we probably shouldn't, and then we lose kind of our own control and not making the best decisions. But then sometimes just avoiding the reality around us and wanting to hope that there is something beyond here better that can numb our experience here that we don't like.
Yeah.
Go for it.
Oh, I was going to say there's a contrasting part of Lovecraft in some of his other stories. I'm thinking specifically of Call of Cthulhu, Mountains of Madness, where he has several stories where you really should not have looked under that rock. It's like you were punished for checking on that story. You found out it was real, and now you're crazy. Good luck with the straitjacket. I mean, he has several stories where I think you guys are exactly right, that the exploration of the self is very important. It's part of the character flaws of our heroes. But I also think that he kind of confuses things by having a lot of stories where you really should have left that alone. You really should have left that alone.
Well, I feel like the essential tension in the body of his work is that many people react to trauma by sort of like folding themselves in the warm blanket of nostalgia, and trying to go back in their own life to a time before that trauma. And many people react to trauma by trying to avoid the past that led up to that trauma and just looking towards the future and running away from who they were before. And I think that's the two things that Lovecraft is continually hovering in midair between. He writes story after story about people who are obsessed with the idea that the past is better, and story after story about people who just take the teensiest peek into their own past and get killed and murdered by their own resurrected ancestor. And at the same time, he has all these stories about the way that technology is cool and science is cool and exploration is cool. And he has all these stories where he just can't resist getting in the dig at people who are immigrants or brown people or black people. And
Yeah.
he's trapped in that idea of like his own, I think, this is my theory, the traumas of his childhood, of especially losing his father, losing his so many people from his family. Um, I think that that is sort of what kicked off this sense that he was very aware he had lost his own connection, like the living connections to his own past. And so he understandably became sort of obsessed with that. And at the same time, he resented the fact that other people got to just like go on and live their lives and let the world grow and change rather
Mhm.
than be obsessed with their own past. And so he writes characters who can't let go of the past and know they'll be destroyed by it and can't embrace the future and know that they're going to be replaced in it.
Mhm.
And that's what he's trying to deal with.
Yeah. So we could add to the list tragedy. He really does a very good job with traditional tragedy storytelling. So speaking of tragedies, we are starting to run out of time. How's that for a segue, guys?
Oh,
Um,
wow.
yeah, we've got a few minutes left. So what I want to do is before we pay the bills, I want to give everybody a chance to take a parting shot at a statement of Randolph Carter or something else with Lovecraft. Is there something you guys want to end with, Kyle?
Well, again, I think that the strength of this kind of origin story of Randolph Carter, introduction to
Hmm.
Randolph Carter, and the blend of technology and going and exploring, uh, starting with kind of books and research and stuff. I think it's a universal theme, and especially before our time now, when there's so many forms of entertainment, like watching panels online of Monsterama. And then we had just books, right? And we had just friends and people that tell us a story, and you pass that oral tradition along and that kind of thing. So it's neat to see the introduction of a character like that is so much like all of us that just are drug along along the way. And the other thing, since you were talking about Rilach, and I'll have to look up that Stephen King story, but my wife and I have a joke about, like, whenever we have kids, hopefully, then we will. My brother, my twin brother Scott, his middle name is Riley. And so I always said, oh, we ought to name, like our daughter, Riley, but not really Riley. It's spelled Rilach. And then when she gets into class, and the teacher, and Riley, are you here? And she'd say, it's Rilach. Oh, can we just call you Riley? No, my dad said it's Rilach.
Michael, I'm sorry, but you have to follow that.
Oh, that's okay. Gosh. Well, so on the Randolph Carter front, I think everybody should read The Dreams of Unknown Kadath, because that's one of those books where, well, book, story, novella, whatever, where Lovecraft just like lets his imagination run free. And that's why he hated it. That's why he didn't try to publish it himself. I think he was intimidated by how creative and imaginative it was, and how it was just like somebody letting the pen run off with them. But I think it's really fun and it's beautiful and has a lot of really neat concepts. The Cats of Ulthar saving him from getting kidnapped and all
Oh
kinds
yeah.
of crazy stuff. And that's a lot of fun. My favorite Randolph Carter story, though, is Through the Gates of the Silver Key, which was a collaborative story, and it's like very late, but it has these completely bonkers concepts of like aliens disguising themselves to bust up a reading of a will, and like it's got so many weird ideas mishmashed together just haphazardly.
Hmm.
And I think it's a lot of fun because the whole notion of Swami Chandraputra is completely insane and ridiculous. um, but I also think that everybody should read At the Mountains of Madness, because that's some of the best science fiction written in the first half of the 20th century.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, I have to say, I know we're running out of time, but I have to say that I am still assuming that at some point I will produce the stage play of The Statement of Randolph Carter. It's one of my favorite Lovecraft short stories. I still think it's one of the most efficient science fiction or horror short stories ever. I would love to see somebody really talented perform this on stage with just a chair and a spotlight and just Lovecraft's amazing story. I am also going to say that I know that we kind of dipped in very gently into some of the tougher Lovecraft conversation. I would love for folks to give us some feedback and let us know if you'd like us to continue the Lovecraft conversations, even the tougher parts of that conversation. I'm up for it. It's just not for this particular hour. Yeah, we take turns. We take turns with this. It's Lovecraft is a lot of fun to talk about, I think, as you might have just noticed. So anyway, so what I want to do is I want to let our esteemed panelists tell us where we can find you on the interwebs. Michael, I think I can tell from here, but go ahead and tell us how we can find you.
Sorry, my publisher likes it when I put up the background.
Yeah.
It's you can find me at www.michaelgwilliamsbooks.com, or you can find me on Twitter as @McManlyPants. And you can find links to all of that, though, on www.michaelgwilliamsbooks.com.
Excellent. Kyle, where can we find you?
On social media, you can find me at Poet Kyle, and I've got 2 books of poetry. One called Slang, which is available most major retailers on websites and Amazon and so forth, and a book of holiday poetry called A Dream of Christmas, which is available on Lulu.com.
Right, which does not star Randolph Carter.
No, it does not, unfortunately.
Unfortunately, and I'm still Darren Bush. You can find me on my you can find my Kindle shorts on the Amazon authors page, Darren M. Bush. And thank you so much for joining us. Let me remind everybody that Virtual Monsterama 2020 is benefiting the MPTF, the Motion Picture and Television Fund, which provides temporary financial assistance for needs created or complicated by the COVID-19 pandemic. To learn more and to please donate, go to mptf.com. That's mptf.com. And keep in mind, while you're watching these movies and these television shows that are interpretations of Lovecraft's work, that we're talking about a charity that assists the people that make those wonderful works of art. So please keep that in mind. And thank you, Monsterama, for listening in on another Lovecraft panel. And thank you to our panelists for your wonderful insights and information. Appreciate that. We're going to say goodbye. Bye-bye.
Bye. And watch Lovecraft Country.
Yes, watch for Lovecraft Country.